Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Beatrice and today I'm back with another video for Jane Austen July for 2024. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the reception of Jane Austen's works from the time when her novels were first published to the present day. This was a suggestion in the comments for my last video in which I announced my Jane Austen July 2024 challenges, and I'm very grateful for the suggestion because I think it's a great video idea and hopefully you will enjoy it too. I think what's interesting about talking about Austen's reception history is that we might assume that she was always as popular as she is now, but that is not entirely true. Because in the past 200 years since her death, there had definitely been times when Austen's novels were not as appreciated as they are now, and times when her novels were in fact more popular, such as the present day. And although they never went out of print, their status as literary works has definitely shifted and gone back and forth over the last couple of centuries. So it's interesting to see why that might be the case. So first of all, we should begin with Austen's own contemporary readers and how they reacted to her works. Austen originally published anonymously under the pseudonym of By a Lady, which was actually quite common for women to do at the time if they were going to start publishing novels. Her identity was simply known as the writer of Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, and then later Mansfield Park and Emma, so it was known that all four novels were by the same author, but her name wasn't known. And eventually, her name was revealed after her death in 1817, when her brother Henry published her earliest manuscript, which Austen herself had previously sold but never been able to actually get published, which is now known as Northanger Abbey, and this was published together with the novel which she completed before her death, which we now know as Persuasion. So when Henry Austen published these two together in 1818 after her death, her name was finally revealed. Her identity, however, was already known to many in the aristocracy and upper middle class. Even the Prince Regent, who would later become George IV, took a fancy to Austen's works and pretty much requested via his librarian that Austen dedicate her next novel to him, which she was essentially required to do when she published Emma, in spite of her personal dislike of the Prince Regent. Other contemporaries of Austen, whether they knew her identity or not, also appreciated her novels. For example, Richard Sheridan, the playwright, was a fan of her work, but it's really another novelist, Sir Walter Scott, who wrote what is, I think, possibly the first really well-known review of an Austen novel. He reviewed Emma in the Quarterly Review in 1816, praising it for its realism and defending it against the charge that it lacks the kind of adventure and intrigue that novels at the time were expected to have, and that his own novels, Walter Scott's own novels, definitely had. Specifically, he mentions that Austen's character studies are so delightful that we never miss the excitation which depends upon a narrative of uncommon events, arising from the consideration of minds, manners, and sentiments greatly above our own. That's the end of the quotation. In other words, although Austen writes about ordinary people and ordinary events, her novels are still engaging. In fact, they are engaging precisely because of it, Walter Scott argues, as it's easier for the readers to imagine themselves in the situation that Austen's characters go through. As these are the kinds of situations that normal people might find themselves in. And that normal people might see in others that they know in their own lives, essentially. So Walter Scott was a fan, but what about after her death? Well, the next review I want to talk about is one from 1821, so just a few years after Austen's death, and it is by Archbishop Richard Whately, who reviewed a few of Austen's works, all in one review, also for the Quarterly Review. And he focused especially on the potential for moral improvement that is to be found in literature. So on this channel, I talk a lot about this. I talk a lot about Austen and the virtues and morality. And but it's interesting to see that, in fact, this is not something that has only been done recently in Jane Austen studies. I often talk about the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre and how he saw Austen as being a writer of the virtues. But in fact, even back in 1821, Archbishop Whately already recognized this. So this was recognized from the very beginning of, I guess, Austen studies or Austen criticism. So Whately was possibly the first person who made this connection and emphasized the importance of virtue and faith in Austen's novels. He thought extremely high of Austen compared to the other popular novelists of her time, claiming that there was no one superior, if equal, to the lady whose last production is now before us. So that's really high praise indeed. What is even more interesting about his review is that he compares the Christian sentiment of her novels favourably to Hannah More, the philanthropist, abolitionist, and novelist who at the time was actually far more popular than Austen and outsold her significantly, but who is now far lesser well known than Austen, funnily enough. Whately judges that moral instruction through literature will come more easily if the reader is coaxed rather than forced into understanding the moral lesson that the writer means to teach. He says the following: Miss Austen has the merit, in our judgment, most essential, of being evidently a Christian writer, a merit which is much enhanced both on the score of good taste and of practical utility, by her religion being not at all obtrusive. She might defy the most fastidious critic to call any of her novels, as Coelebs, Hannah More's novel, was designated, we will not say altogether without reason, a dramatic sermon. The subject is rather alluded to, and that incidentally, than studiously brought forward and dwelt upon. In fact, she is more sparing of it than would be thought desirable by some persons, perhaps even by herself had she consulted merely her own sentiments. But she probably introduced it as far as she thought would be generally acceptable and profitable. For when the purpose of inculcating a religious principle is made too palpably prominent, many readers, if they do not throw aside the book with disgust, are apt to fortify themselves with that respectful kind of apathy with which they undergo a regular sermon, and prepare themselves, as they do, to swallow a dose of medicine, endeavouring to get it down in large gulps, without tasting more than is necessary. Now that is a rather long quotation, but I included all of it because I think this is so fascinating in understanding why Jane Austen, although she might not have been as popular as someone like Hannah More with her novel Coelebs at the time, has actually stayed more popular in the long term. I think Whately has some really wonderful insights here. That's why I quoted the whole passage, even though it's very wordy. He is basically saying that although Austen herself was someone whose faith was strong, and she might have wanted to be more preachy, like she was writing a sermon in her novels, she decided very cleverly to not be too obtrusive, as he terms it, in her religious sentiment in her novels, because she knew that a lot of people at the time, although they might have been nominal Christians, were not necessarily very devout. And she was trying to appeal to more people, not just for the sake of selling. He's not making the argument that she is a sellout or materialistic. Rather, he's saying that she realized that she could persuade people into goodness, into becoming more faithful, into becoming a better people, more moral people, if the Christian sentiment was sort of hidden enough in the narrative, not obtrusive, not too explicit, that people would gradually come to accept it, rather than being told it from the offset, like you would find in a Hannah More novel, which might result in people simply disengaging with it, or I guess accepting it but with apathy, as Whately argues. I happen to agree with him, and I think it's really, really interesting that he says this, because let's look at what's happened in the last 200 years. Hannah More's novels are not well known. Hannah More herself is really only well known now for being an abolitionist and for helping William Wilberforce in the abolitionist cause, but her novels are not really widely read at all. And you could argue that Austen, even now in a post-Christian secular society, that she's still perhaps bringing people closer to the Christian faith indirectly than Hannah More can do, because simply her novels are simply not read anymore. But at the time, Hannah More was becoming a lot more popular than Austen. So Whately is kind of saying, whether intentionally or not, Austen is playing the long game. But Hannah More at the time, although she might not be well known now, was definitely more popular. And her style of writing actually became a lot more popular during the Victorian era, although it might not have been in the Regency era when the novels were first published. So unfortunately for Austen, during the Victorian era, the British public gradually acquired a taste precisely for the kind of obtrusive didacticism in literature, which Whately says is not a good feature. And her reputation, although it never fully waned, was certainly not even comparable to the likes of Charles Dickens or George Eliot, which is a pseudonym for Mary Ann Evans, who enjoyed much greater critical and commercial success than Austen. So a lot of readers in the 19th century found Austen's style too subdued and her plots too uneventful, the very things that Walter Scott liked, the Victorians did not like. Charlotte Bronte, one of the Bronte sisters and best known for her novel Jane Eyre, famously found Austen's writing lacking in sentiment and in descriptive power. There were some defenders of Austen, for example, literary critic George Henry Lewis, who happened to be the novelist George Eliot's de facto husband, who tried to convince Charlotte Bronte that Austen was an amazing writer, but these kinds of critics were few and far between. Now, there's a lot that happens between the 1850s, the kind of heyday of the Victorian era, and the end of the Victorian era. But for the sake of keeping this video a reasonable length, I'll jump ahead to 1911, when Shakespeare scholar A.C. Bradley wrote a lecture on Austen, which is pretty much the first piece of, I guess, modern literary criticism that we have of her works. Bradley praises Austen and focuses on her ability to unite moral concerns and satire, calling her a moralist and a humorist. His essay is incredibly influential because it paves the way for literary criticism to take Austen seriously as a writer of great merit for the rest of the 20th century and up to this day. In fact, I love this essay so much that the title of my undergraduate dissertation, which I now submitted 5 years ago, which makes me feel very old, is Jane Austen, a Moralist and a Humorist. And I took this title from Bradley's own essay. Then, in the 1920s, R.W. Chapman published Austen's collected works, which included her minor works and her juvenilia being published for the first time ever. And again, this helped to get Austen to become a truly established writer, a literary giant in the academic world and for, the wider public. All the major literary critics in the 20th century take Austen seriously, whether they like her or not, they talk about her, but most of them do admire her. For example, Virginia Woolf, and later in the 20th century, Lionel Trilling and Harold Bloom. In the 70s and 80s, her works were at once used by feminist critics like Gilbert and Guba in their really, really influential book on 19th century female authors, The Mad Woman in the Attic, but also by virtue ethicists like MacIntyre in his seminal work After Virtue, published in 1981. So everyone is writing about Austen, regardless of their own literary, political, social priorities and persuasions. People are interested in her work. So at this point, Jane Austen is the darling of the literary world, beloved by academics, but also by the reading public. Because, she was already very well beloved, but I would say that in the 90s, she became even bigger literary phenomenon, I suppose. So almost 30 years ago now, in 1995, the famous BBC adaptation of Pride and Prejudice hit the screen, And I cannot overstate the impact that this had on Austen's popularity. Since then, Austen's novels seem to get a new adaptation every couple of years. Sometimes there's an even quicker turnaround than that. Not to mention loads of modern retellings, both in novel form and also as adaptations of modern retellings. In fact, Austen has become such a huge part of our culture that people have become obsessed with anything set in the Regency era, despite the fact that I guess 3 of her major novels were actually written in the 1790s before the Regency, but in our minds her novels have become so associated with the Regency era, so the 1810s, that people have become obsessed with anything set in that time period, which explains the immense popularity of shows like Bridgerton, for example. Some would say that this has meant a cheapening of Austen. Others think it's good to adapt her works freshly every few years so that new readers may be introduced to her. I think this entirely depends on how you do it. I'm not a purist, and I like to think that I'm not too much of a snob when it comes to adapting Austen, at least not to the extent that I would allow no creative license in adapting her works. On this channel, for example, I often talk about how much I love the 2020 adaptation of Emma, in spite of the fact that that film does take some creative liberties with the original material in the novel. On the other hand, I also do think that there are times when it's okay to be a little bit snobbish and to say this adaptation just isn't good. For example, with the 2022 adaptation of Persuasion, which I think essentially does a very poor job of adapting the novel and tries to make it relatable, but fails to do either that or to really respect the original material. So for me, I think it really depends on the individual adaptation, but generally speaking, I don't mind that Austen's novels have been adapted so much and have become so popular, because I think that's a good introduction for new readers. I actually first saw the 2005 film of Pride and Prejudice when I was, 8, 9, and that was technically my very first introduction to Austen. And over time, I've come to love the BBC adaptation from the 90s perhaps a little bit more. But if it hadn't been for the film, perhaps I wouldn't have discovered Austen so early in life. So I'm grateful for new adaptations, and I think there's nothing necessarily wrong with her being so popular, but as long as they are adapted at least somewhat faithfully. Now, I don't know what the future will bring, but I imagine that Austen's reputation will only increase and solidify over time. I would guess it would be quite unlikely for her to just not be widely read anymore, until at least as long as her novels are still easy to read. So, for example, Shakespeare is this literary giant as well. He's the best known author in English literature, in the English language perhaps, but and there are still loads of people going to see his plays, but he's not perhaps so read by just normal readers at home. We don't read his plays so much, and partly because they are plays, but also partly because the English language has changed a little bit since the 16th century, and so it's a little bit harder to read them. So perhaps that could happen to Austen one day, 200-300 years from now, if the English language has changed enough that Austen becomes difficult to read. Perhaps fewer people will read her, but I don't imagine her reputation as a literary genius, I suppose, will wane particularly easily, not now that she's become so well established. And all of this, think how impressive this is for someone whose name was never even published in her novels when her novels were first published during her lifetime. So I think this is incredibly impressive, and as you can imagine, I'm very glad that she has found so much success, since I love her works so very much. But what are your thoughts? Do you think it's good that Austen has become so widely read, or do you wish she had stayed, let's say, a well-kept secret among the literary community, or even if she had remained at the same level of popularity of someone like George Eliot, whose novels, especially Middlemarch, are really appreciated by very kind of bookish people, but they are perhaps not as well known amongst non-readers. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I guess in many ways this is a question of, shall we gatekeep the works of literature that we love? Does that preserve them from being badly adapted and misunderstood? Or is it a good thing that they should be as widely known as possible? I'm curious about your thoughts. I'm curious to hear when you first encountered Jane Austen, what made you fall in love with her novels, if you of her novels. So yeah, let me know what you think in the comments below. Now, I hope I will be able to make one more Jane Austen July video. I'm not quite sure what on yet, so again, leave your suggestions in the comments below and hopefully I will be able to do this. And if not, by the end of July, then sometime in early August, I might do a little roundup and tell you about what I was able to finish reading from the Jane Austen July challenges for this year. Now, I hope you have a wonderful weekend and I will see you very soon in my next video. Bye.